Hello, everyone. Welcome to
right.
So What, the Marketing Analytics and Insights live show from Trust to Insights. Today, Christopher Penn and I are here. Katie Robert is off. Her husband works on the front lines. We appreciate his service, and she's taking advantage of a little pre-holiday time to go off and just have some fun and have a little bit of a vacation. But yeah, Chris, we've got a lot of stuff up today. We're talking about Instagram in the past. Well, I'll let you even tell the tale about some past research on Instagram, but we're going to talk about the core of it is hashtags and if they work for Instagram. And pretty much with that, I will throw to you.
All right. Reminder, folks, if you're watching on Facebook, you need to authorize at StreamYard.com/Facebook so we can see your comments. Otherwise, we get nothing at all. So, yeah, a while back, our friends over at Agora Pulse put up this blog post, and it's a really it's a well thought out post on do Instagram hashtags really lead to more engagement. This is about 3 years old now, so it's a little on the older side. And I like stuff like this. I like stuff like this because I like to see people trying, science. The challenge that I think we run into sometimes is we don't necessarily have either the right data or the right methodology to really do the science in depth. So if you read through this article, it's a fairly long one here. They do some testing. They look at 4 Instagram accounts. They post some stuff with hashtags, some stuff with not. And they conclude that Instagram posts with hashtags increase likes by 70%. So I said, it's 2020. This post is a few years old. A little bit has changed Instagram since then. And the question is what would this look like if we did it with more data, larger data, and current data? And that's where this whole idea for today's episode came from, was the fact that we don't have any of those things with this older post. So the first place we want to start is where are we going to get the data? Now, there's a couple different places you can get data, but the one that we use a lot is a service from Facebook called CrowdTangle. We were grandfathered into this. We used to be a paying customer until they turned it to a free tool, but then they closed the doors. It's only open now to journalists and stuff. It's really intended for journalism and academic research, which we actually do a fair amount for. What's cool about it is you can load up a list of accounts and then export all the posts for that account for up to 2 years worth of back data, which is really, really handy. And as long as the account is public, you can get the data. And it works for Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit. They used to do Twitter, but then Facebook and Twitter had a little falling out. So that's the first step. And if you don't have access to this tool, your best bet is going to be working with Facebook's API directly. They have an Instagram graph API. You can write software to connect to it. It's kind of cumbersome and it requires a lot of hoops to jump through. And there's some pretty firm limits. But if you have access to a tool like CrowdTangle, that's a good place to start. And you can also do what Scott did in his post, which is, just run a bunch of tests. If you happen to work at an agency or something, you can run a bunch of tests on client accounts with their permission to get the same thing. But I like to have a large amount of data. So that's step one. The second step is we got to explore this data set. How large is it? So we pulled together a list, actually a couple lists. Inside the tool, we have 4,200 brands and all of the stuff that they are sharing. And then we have a list from CrowdTangle of influencers. And this is a crazy, crazy long list of 11,190 influencers. And there's a lot of duplicates and stuff in here, but there's so much data to be had. So the next step in the process is we got to get the data out of here and start figuring out what it looks like. Now, John, when you do social media analysis, what is stuff that you typically look at? Like when you're looking for, conversations and things, when you're looking at marketing over coffee, what is it that you look for?
Well, the biggest thing is that, the stuff that you've done, that Trust Insights does, where you're not just looking at pure volume, how much junk has been posted. You're not looking at just raw followers. Likes, you're starting to get to some actionable stuff. But really, the machine learning stuff you've done, if you can look at what content is being shared by others, that's the real measure of, what's effective and what is moving the needle and where the true influencers are. It's not just that they have millions of followers, it's that when they put something out there, it actually gets liked or shared.
Yeah. Now, the challenge with that is Instagram doesn't have that whole lot of that data. They do have handles, the same as Twitter handles. But for the most part, we can't see what happens after somebody leaves Instagram. And that's true of everything except, obviously, sites we own in Google Analytics. So that's not visible. So for this experiment, we're probably going to want to look at just engagement and kind of hope that engagement leads to results later on. I mean, the challenge with engagement is you can get a lot of engagement for all the wrong things.
Right. Well, and then you do, the good news is that if you're measuring something you're caring about, you can close the link. You actually do see how many folks come in the door and convert. So it's not as if we're just kind of praying that large numbers equal success. We can at least see where they convert.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and this is going to be a bit like a cooking show, because loading 3 million posts on Instagram into any kind of data processing software is a bad idea. It will take a really long time. So what we did is we pulled in, we have 1.3 million brand posts and 1.6 million influencer posts for a total of 3 million posts in total. Now, the first thing you got to do with all data, but especially with Facebook's data, because Facebook is not great about this, is you got to clean it up. One of the things that we found is that their data tends to be very messy, and what users put into comments and in just posts, titles, and things tends to be even more garbage. It's astonishing just how much garbage is in these things. So the first step in any of these processes is, okay, let's go in, let's clean things up. So you have a really long function that basically says, let's create things like comment rates, engagement rates, video rates, mark things whether it's paid or not. And critically, for our purposes today, count the number of uses of the pound sign as part of a hashtag, with the words and numbers after that. So our first run through, go through and clean all this stuff up. What we end up with, like I said, is 3 million posts. And we want to ask ourselves the very naive question: is there a relationship of any kind between hashtags and what we're going after? The original post was likes. Should we do likes or should we do engagements? Like all engagements?
Well, your call. Either way, crushing the article is always interesting to me.
All right, let's do likes. Let's do likes, comments, and engagements. Right? I think that seems like a safe and comprehensive look. So we're going to do a little bit of data processing here. All this is going to do is put our data together and get those measures into one spot, and then we're going to do what's called a correlation plot. Now, a correlation plot is real straightforward. It uses simple correlation and it answers the question: is there a relationship between two sets of variables? Let's see what we come up with here. We have our numeric thing with 7 variables. We have our Spearman correlation. And let's draw a plot. There we are. Okay, let's zoom in on this. So what we're looking for here is we want to know, is there a relationship between all these variables? And this is where correlation plots are super handy, because you can see across the board what the relationships are. So we see, for example, there's a almost perfect correlation between engagements and likes. That makes sense, right? Because this is actually a case of what's called high correlation. Oh God, it's not linear dependency. It's basically saying you have one number, it's made up of other numbers. So of course you're going to have a perfect correlation. If you were doing machine learning, this would be a really bad thing. You'd want to knock out the things that are composed of each other. But so yeah, you have a perfect correlation between engagements and likes. You have a very strong correlation between engagements and the number of followers you have at posting. You have a very strong correlation between engagements and comments. You have a weaker relationship between engagements and engagement rate. You have no relationship between engagements and views. And here's where we are. There's there's actually a slight negative relationship, not enough to be statistically relevant, but they're basically saying no relationship between the number of hashtags and the number of engagements. The same is true for likes, even less so for comments and things. So our first pass at this, we're like, we don't see it. We don't see that experiment design showing up where there's this negative relationship. So at this point, John, what do we do?
Yeah, well, it's a big negative there. Now, I'm just wanted to be clear too. So engagements and likes are even, and engagements or comments are less though. Now, every comment is an engagement, but that's because it's shorter because the majority of engagements are just likes with no comments. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, the vast majority of engagements are people smashing the like button.
And then as far as where the statistically relevant mark is this everything is statistically relevant, as like a P of 2, or is it have to be over 0.2 here for us to consider it relevant?
So this is a Spearman correlation, and that means that generally speaking, anything between minus 0.25 and plus 0.25 is really weak. There's not much there. Anything between 0.25 and 0.5 is moderate on both positive and negative. Anything above 0.5 is strong, saying, yep, there's a there of some kind. There's some kind of relationship. Now, this obviously does not look at all at anything like causality and stuff. It's just saying there's a mathematical pattern matching between these two things. And the first step in this kind of investigation would be like, is there a pattern match? Like, do we see any relationship at all between hashtags and these measures? And the answer really is no, there isn't.
Yeah, not only we're not even at 0.2, like you said, it's actually negative. It could be reversed. So first order to the marketing team is just don't bother with hashtags?
Well, I would say that the initial conclusion the article came up with that, you have to be using hashtags to get engagement. At the first pass, we're coming up empty. So what we should do now is dig into this a bit more. And the question is, how would we test this a bit more to see, is there something else at work here? One of the challenges that you run into with very naive tests like this is that there can be very, very badly matched samples. If a million posts, if 3 million posts, there's 3 million posts and 2.5 million don't use hashtags, and only 500,000 use hashtags, then you've got a really unbalanced sample set, and that means that you may be drawing conclusions incorrectly, right? The ideal, and again, this is where hats off to the Agora Pulse team. The ideal way to do it is to do that controlled A/B test. Like that's really a really good way of doing things. The challenge you run into is obviously if you only have a handful of accounts and they're not in different industries and things like that, then you're going to come up with an underpowered test. So there's a way to simulate an A/B test with a technique called propensity score matching. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to basically say, even just split the group, all these posts into two groups. One group uses hashtags, one group doesn't, right? Let's worry about the number of hashtags later. Just want to find out. Call the group that uses hashtags, we call it like a treatment, right? Because they've done the thing, and call the group without hashtags the control. They didn't do the thing. What we want to do is we want to do a sample. We can't do the whole data set because my computer will melt. And this show will be 11 hours long, 10 and a half hours, which will be just staring at the screen. So we're going to take a sample of the 3 million. Now, again, this is where a lot of people tend to go wrong. The question is, how large a sample should you use? There are any number of really good, simple sample size calculators on the web. This one, it's like the first Google result. I said, I want a 99% confidence interval, which means that if I repeat this test 100 times, 99% of the time will come out with the same answer. And I want a confidence interval of 1%, meaning every answer I get will be plus or minus 1% correct. Like that's a pretty solid. If you want to get really, really aggressive, you can do it 0.5%. What size population would I need to survey out of my 3 million people in order to get that 0.5% margin of error? I would need 65,000. So let's go back here. And in my sample, I'm going to do exactly that. I'm going to sample my data set and choose 65 at random, 65,000 samples here. What do we got here? It says, I ate my treatment file. There we go. Okay, so I now have a sample of 65,000 randomly chosen. That's going to be a big enough sample to go, okay, there's some statistical reliability here. Let's go ahead and run our matching. And what we're doing is we're taking this sample, we're splitting it into two groups, and then we're looking, and the software is going to go through and identify and try and match up and create a subset of this, of saying which posts are similar. So like, John, if you have 1,000 Instagram followers and I have like 10,000 followers, there's a good chance that we're not a good match, right? Because we're different. But if you have 1,000 followers on Instagram and I have 1,200, it's probably a closer match, right? We're more alike than we are different numerically. And so comparing our results would make more sense, as opposed to comparing, either one of us with, like, I don't know, pick a celebrity of your choice. I don't know. I'm trying to
Kardashian. We'll throw a Kardashian in there.
Let's do Dwayne Johnson, right? Dwayne Johnson posts on Instagram and millions of dollars of things get sold. So what we want to do with this technique, and this is a technique that's super useful for all kinds of marketing data, is we want to do that, run that sample and figure out, okay, what does it look like? So we have here our balanced data set. Here's the control, here's the treatment. What are the differences? Actually, in our sample set, we see that people use hashtags have gotten substantially worse performance on stuff. So now we're really into head scratching territory. Like, what the heck is going on here? Out of this, a statistically valid sample, we're seeing some substantial differences between these two groups, and in particular, the engagement rate is much lower between the treatment and control group for the hashtag. So now we're like, I think we might have poked another hole in this thesis that you must use hashtags for engagement. At least for where we are, that's not the case.
We had a funny, David chimed in with a question, said he's worked with a statistician that liked said 85 was still a coin toss, and he wanted to have his clients do it 99%. If that was the case, I'd love to have an 85% confidence coin toss and play for money, but that's just me. I can see where he's coming from with that, though.
Oh yeah, totally. Because an 85% confidence interval, if you think about it, if you run a test 100 times and 85% of the time it comes out okay, and 15% of the time you can't reduce the results, you're like, that's a lot of variability, right? It's like, what a revolver has six things, right? 1 out of 6 is 16%. So basically, you're playing Russian roulette at that point. If you have a 1 in 6 chance of being wrong, that's not great odds. I would rather I'd rather have the 1 chance in 90 out of 99 that things have gone wrong. Certainly for stuff like this. So what we've done here is we've done a simple test of correlation and found that there was no relationship. And then when we did a dug into the sample and tried to do basically a retroactive A/B test, we found that actually for this sample set and this group of people, hashtags didn't help things. In fact, hashtags might have made things worse. So what do you think, John? Should we just completely can using hashtags on Instagram?
I don't know. Is there any way to flip it to find out if there's any things that did well that do have more hashtags? Is there any way to look at it from the other angle, or is it just better to call this dead?
That's a good question. I would say the next step, because we're talking about a massive list here. This is across tens of thousands of accounts on Instagram, brands and individuals. I think the next step, if this was something that a client had engaged us to do, would be, okay, let's get together a curated list of a couple hundred accounts just in the industrial concrete industry or whatever the client's industry would be, and say, okay, let's see how this looks specific to your industry and see if there's a different pattern. Because again, we've done here, we've lumped Toyota and JetBlue and the Republican Party and Smith and Wesson all together into this one
Bob's
big,
Pizza too, tiny geo.
exactly, Bob's Pizza, it's just one giant gumbo pot, and everything kind of gets mashed together. Whereas if you're looking at a specific industry, that industry may have very, very tailored things that are going on that could be like, okay, we need to maybe focus in on just this thing. In fact, yeah, we've got a little time. Well, no, because we have to reload the whole data set, and that takes about 20 minutes. I would say, one thing we could do in the future is identify, are there accounts that use hashtags sometimes, but not all the time? And if so, then can we look at the hashtags they use and say, okay, can we narrow in on that industry? Like, women's shoes, for example, it's our favorite go-to for examples, to say, okay, what about just this in women's shoes? Could we identify just those people, and then build ourselves a data set and test it just for women's shoes? Let me think about this. Could we do that?
How hard can we push R without it running without your laptop bursting into flames?
Completely. Let's try. What is the field name here for people foaming at the mouth? Description. But pick a hashtag.
Oh, that's a tough one. How about pound fashion?
Fashion. I like fashion. Okay. Let's drink. We want this to be all this fashion count. And we're going to need to replicate that for our influencers as well. I bet we're going to get a ton more influencers than. Let's see how long this takes if this utterly melts down.
Yeah, is there any, as far as I know, there's no public hashtag data. You can't just say like, okay, here's the top 200 hashtags.
So there are data sets that say that. I don't know how reliable they are. Like, I don't know where they're getting the data from.
Right. That must be scraped. It's not from the API.
Okay, let's see what we get here. Out of those 3 million posts in each, we're going to get 29,000 brand and 17,000 influencers. That's interesting. I would have expected the opposite to be true. Okay, let's put together ourselves a take our 2 fashion data sets here, trim those down. And now let's rerun our correlation plot with just our smaller set. Let's see what we got for fashion. Interesting. So now, with hashtag count and engagement rate, there's a minor positive relationship. So in just this, hashtags may work for fashion.
But it's not going to triple your.
Huh?
Well, it's not going to triple your results. I mean, we see a slight.
No, but there's a problem. We filtered by a hashtag, so inherently every result contains a hashtag. Right? We don't have any data in our set of accounts that were in this space that did not use a hashtag, because by default we counted the fashion hashtag.
Right, and so we don't see a correlation between hashtag and likes or engagements. Right.
So let's do this. Let's take just the word fashion. That will get us, I think, a little bit closer to where we want to be, because that would occur whether or not you use the hashtag.
It's unfortunate I'm not strong enough in R to actually be able to do play-by-play here.
So we are at now, we now have 70,000 posts just using the word fashion for brands, 45,000 not. So now we're much more, we have, again, a correctly balanced data set. We jump on in here to our chart and we see still not rocking the relationship. So even here for just a subset, there isn't a there.
Yeah.
So I think, you could obviously repeat this over and over again for, wine or sports or politics, and probably get similar results. But I'm starting to feel like this might be, barking up the wrong tree for the hashtag side of things.
Yeah, right. So that would be the last step for a company that you would take the 10, 15 hashtags you think work, and you could actually see for those if they literally work or not.
Exactly. And you'd use the generic term and then see if there's the skew between the generic and the thing. Let's pick one more. What do you want to use to have fashion?
Oh, travel is huge and stuff.
Travel's going to be too big. Pick something niche, something like, a little bit obscure.
How about cosplay?
Oh yeah, that's a good one. I like that. All right, let's see what we got here. Okay, so we ended up with 68 posts by brands, 234 by people. It's a really small group.
Yeah, that's folks. A lot more niche than I thought it would be.
Yeah. Well, keep in mind, these are brands and influencers broadly. These are not people specific to cosplay. Like, we did not put together a cosplay influencer list. So you're not going to get a ton of that. When we look in here, we actually have now an actual negative correlation, which means that as hashtags go up, engagement goes down. So it's a negative for cosplay, which is as a term. This is really interesting because now we're at a point where hashtags actually hurt more than help there. And again, we don't know why, because we're not looking at the underlying data to see if these are just, maybe they're posts that were just, bland or whatever. And obviously this is not addressing things like post quality. Is it to the right audience? Did you boost it? This is just the raw organic stuff, but definitely a case of there's not a there.
Yeah, and just trying to, as you start to think about what actually draws that. So my first thought would be that if they're spammy posts, that's why the hashtags are in there, and those aren't doing well. So that would be one theory. Another, and even to take it up another level too, I was trying to think the only way hashtags can make a difference, right, is that you're assuming that users have standing searches for those hashtags, right? I mean, is there any other use case where how else could hashtags help?
I get a hashtag is mainly a discovery function, right? You use a hashtag because somebody taps on it because they want to follow it and see stuff in there. So there may be some opportunities to use that for discovery, but it may or may not lead to engagement. It may just lead to people finding your stuff.
Yeah, good point.
One of the things that is not in here is we did not attempt to track changes in follower counts from post to post to see if certain numbers of posts generated more followers. So that's also not in here. That's something that has to be computed separately. But it's definitely a case of there's it's not looking good. It's not looking good. So
all right.
So that pretty much wraps up today's show for what data is available for Instagram, how to explore it using a utility, like R. You can use other tools. There are, plenty of tools. IBM's SPSS modeler is a fantastic tool. Disclosure, we're an IBM business partner, but it's a drag and drop clickable interface rather than writing code. It's a lot easier for folks. On a small enough data set, you could do this with Excel, right? There's nothing wrong with good old fashioned Microsoft Excel. It gets the job done a lot of the time. And then from here, once we do the analysis, we walk through a couple of different steps, a couple of different tests to look at the data and figure out, what's the next step? What should we do? And then in this case, we've pretty much ascertained, I think, there may not be a there. So if you got follow-up questions and stuff, by all means, let us know. We'll put up some information about where you can follow up with us. But John, any parting thoughts on our great Instagram hashtag test?
Yeah, I don't need to hashtag any of this stuff when I post it to Instagram, so we're good.
I would say if you're going to do it, test it. Test it on your account, because at the end of the day, the only account you really care about is yours. Right? So test it and see if it works for you. If it doesn't work for you, great. You're an outlier. If it doesn't work for you, well, we kind of found that out. So, all right. Well, let's roll on out of here, and we will talk to you folks next week. Thanks for watching today. Be sure to subscribe to our show wherever you're watching it. For more resources and to learn more, check out the Trust Insights podcast at trustinsights.ai/TI podcast and a weekly email newsletter at trustinsights.ai/newsletter. Got questions about what you saw in today's episode? Join our free Analytics for Marketers Slack group at trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers. See you next time.